Captain Blood by Rafael Sabatini. Chapter 1. The Messenger. Peter Blood, Bachelor of Medicine and several other things besides, smoked a pipe and tended the geraniums boxed on the sill of his window above Water Lane in the town of Bridgewater. Sternly disapproving eyes considered him from a window opposite, but went disregarded. Mr. Blood's attention was divided between the task and the stream of humanity in the narrow street below, pouring for the second time that day in the direction of Castle Field, where earlier in the afternoon Ferguson, the Duke's chaplain, had preached a sermon that contained more treason than divinity. These straggling, excited groups were mainly composed of men with green bows in their hats and the most ludicrous of weapons in their hands. Some, it is true, shouldered fowling pieces, and here and there a sword was brandished, but more of them were armed with clubs, and the most of them trailed the mammoth pikes fashioned out of scythes, as formidable to the eye as they were clumsy to the hand. They were weavers, brewers, carpenters, smiths, masons, bricklayers, cobblers, and representatives of every other of the trades of peace among these improvised men of war. Bridgewater, like Taunton, had yielded so generously of its manhood to the service of the bastard Duke, that for any to abstain whose age and strength admitted of his bearing arms was to brand himself a coward or a papist. Yet Peter Blood, who was not only able to bear arms, but trained and skilled in their use, who was certainly no coward, and a papist only when it so suited him, tended his geraniums and smoked his pipe on that warm July evening as indifferently as if nothing were afoot. One other thing he did. He flung after those war-fevered enthusiasts a line of Horace, a poet for whose work he had early conceived an inordinate attachment. Quo celesti ruitis? And now perhaps you guess why the hot, intrepid Blood inherited from the roving sires of his Somersetshire mother remained cool amidst all this frenzied, fanatical heat of rebellion, why the turbulent spirit which had forced him once from the sedate academical bonds his father would have imposed upon him, should now remain quiet in the very midst of turbulence. You realize how he regarded these men who were rallying to the banners of liberty, the banners woven by the virgins of Taunton, the girls from the seminaries of Miss Blake and Mrs. Musgrove, who, as the ballad runs, had ripped open their silk petticoats to make colours for King Monmouth's army. That Latin line, contemptuously flung after them as they clattered down the cobbled streets, reveals his mind. To him they were fools rushing in wicked frenzy to their ruin. You see, he knew too much about this fellow Monmouth, and the pretty brown slut who had borne him, to be deceived by the legend of legitimacy, on the strength of which this standard of rebellion had been raised. He had read the absurd proclamation posted at the cross at Bridgewater, as it had been posted also at Taunton and elsewhere, setting forth that upon the decease of our sovereign Lord Charles II, the right of succession to the crown of England, Scotland, France, and Ireland, with the dominions and territories thereunto belonging, did legally descend and devolve upon the most illustrious and high-born Prince James, Duke of Monmouth, son and heir apparent to the said King Charles II. It had moved him to laughter, as had the further announcement that James, Duke of York, did first cause the said late king to be poisoned, and immediately thereupon did usurp and invade the crown. He knew not which was the greater lie, for Mr. Blood had spent a third of his life in the Netherlands, where this same James Scott, who now proclaimed himself James II, by the grace of God, King, etc., etc., first saw the light some 36 years ago, and he was acquainted with the story current there of the fellow's real paternity. Far from being legitimate, by virtue of a pretended secret marriage between Charles Stuart and Lucy Walter, it was possible that this Monmouth, who now proclaimed himself King of England, was not even the illegitimate child of the late sovereign. What but ruin and disaster could be the end of this grotesque pretension? How could it be hoped that England would ever swallow such a Perkin? And it was on his behalf to uphold his fantastic claim that these West Country clods, led by a few armigerous Whigs, had been seduced into rebellion. Quo celesti ruitus? He laughed and sighed in one, but the laugh dominated the sigh, for Mr. Blood was unsympathetic, as are most self-sufficient men, and he was very self-sufficient. Adversity had taught him so to be. A more tender-hearted man, possessing his vision and his knowledge, might have found cause for tears in the contemplation of these ardent, simple, nonconformist sheep going forth to the shambles, escorted to the rallying ground on Castle Field by wives and daughters, sweethearts and mothers, sustained by the delusion that they were to take the field in defense of right, of liberty, and of religion. For he knew, as all Bridgewater knew, and had known now for some hours, that it was Monmouth's intention to deliver battle that same night. The Duke was to lead a surprise attack upon the Royalist army under Feversham, that was now encamped on Sedgemoor. He thought it very probable that Lord Feversham was equally well informed, and if in this assumption he was wrong, at least he was justified of it. He was not to suppose that Royalist commander so indifferently skilled in the trade he followed. Mr. Blood knocked the ashes from his pipe and drew back to close his window. As he did so, his glance, traveling straight across the street, met at last the glance of those hostile eyes that watched him. There were two pairs, and they belonged to the Misses Pitt, two amiable, sentimental maiden ladies, who yielded to none in Bridgewater in their worship of the handsome Monmouth. Mr. Blood smiled and inclined his head, for he was on friendly terms with these ladies, one of whom, indeed, had been for a little while his patient. But there was no response to his greeting. Instead, the eyes gave him back a stare of cold disdain. The smile on his thin lips grew a little broader, a little less pleasant. He understood the reason of that hostility, which had been daily growing in this past week since Monmouth had come to turn the brains of women of all ages. The Misses Pitt, he apprehended, contemned him that he, a young and vigorous man of a military training which might now be valuable to the cause, should stand aloof, that he should placidly smoke his pipe and tend his geraniums on this evening of all evenings, when men of spirit were rallying to the Protestant champion, offering their blood to place him on the throne where he belonged. If Mr. Blood had condescended to debate the matter with these ladies, he might have urged that, having had his fill of wandering and adventuring, he was now embarked upon the career for which he had been originally intended and for which his studies had equipped him. That he was a man of medicine and not of war, a healer, not a slayer. But they would have answered him, he knew, that in such a cause it behooved every man who deemed himself a man to take up arms. They would have pointed out their own nephew Jeremiah, who was by trade a sailor, the master of a ship, which by an ill chance for that young man had come to harbor at this season in Bridgewater Bay, had quitted the helm to snatch up a musket in defense of right. But Mr. Blood was not of those who argue. As I have said, he was a self-sufficient man. He closed the window, drew the curtains, and turned to the pleasant candle-lit room, and the table at which Mrs. Barlow, his housekeeper, was in the very act of spreading supper. To her, however, he spoke aloud his thought. "It's out of favour I am with vinegary virgins over the way." He had a pleasant, vibrant voice, whose metallic ring was softened and muted by the Irish accent, which in all his wanderings he had never lost. It was a voice that could woo seductively and caressingly, or command in such a way as to compel obedience. Indeed, the man's whole nature was in that voice of his. For the rest of him, he was tall and spare, swarthy of tint as a gypsy, with eyes that were startlingly blue in that dark face, and under those level black brows. In their glance those eyes flanking a high-bridged, intrepid nose, were of singular penetration and of a steady haughtiness that went well with his firm lips. Though dressed in black as became his calling, yet it was with an elegance derived from the love of clothes that is peculiar to the adventurer he had been, rather than to the staid medicus he now was. His coat was of fine camlet, and it was laced with silver. There were ruffles of Mechlin at his wrists, and a Mechlin cravat encased his throat. His great black periwig was as sedulously curled as any at Whitehall. Seeing him thus, and perceiving his real nature, which was plain upon him, you might have been tempted to speculate how long such a man would be content to lie in this little backwater of the world in which chance had swept him some 6 months ago, how long he would continue to pursue the trade for which he had qualified himself before he had begun to live. Difficult of belief though it may be, when you know his history, previous and subsequent, yet it is possible that but for the trick that fate was about to play him, he might have continued this peaceful existence, settling down completely to the life of a doctor in this Somersetshire haven. It is possible, but not probable. He was the son of an Irish medicus, by a Somersetshire lady in whose veins ran the rover blood of the Frobishers, which many account for a certain wildness that had early manifested itself in his disposition. This wildness had profoundly alarmed his father, who, for an Irishman, was of a singularly peace-loving nature. He had early resolved that the boy should follow his own honorable profession, and Peter Blood, being quick to learn and oddly greedy of knowledge, had satisfied his parent by receiving at the age of 20 the degree of Baccalaureus Medicinae at Trinity College, Dublin. His father survived that satisfaction by 3 months only. His mother had been dead for some years already. Thus Peter Blood came into an inheritance of some few £100, with which he had set out to see the world and give for a season of free rein to that restless spirit by which he was imbued. A set of curious chances led him to the service with the Dutch, then at war with France, and a predilection for the sea made him elect that this service should be upon that element. He had the advantage of a commission under the famous De Ruyter, and fought in the Mediterranean engagement in which the great Dutch admiral lost his life. After the peace of Nijmegen, his movements are obscure, but we know that he spent 2 years in a Spanish prison, though we do not know how he contrived to get there. It may be due to this that upon his release he took his sword to France, and saw service with the French in their warring upon the Spanish Netherlands. Having reached at last the age of 32, his appetite for adventure surfeited. His health having grown indifferent as the result of a neglected wound, he was suddenly overwhelmed by homesickness. He took ship from Nantes, with intent to cross to Ireland, but the vessel being driven by stress of weather into Bridgewater Bay, and Blood's health having grown worse during the voyage, he decided to go ashore there, additionally urged to it by the fact that it was his mother's native soil. Thus, January of the year 1685, he had come to Bridgewater, possessor of a fortune that was approximately the same as that with which he had originally set out from Dublin 11 years ago, because he liked the place in which his health was rapidly restored to him, and because he conceived that he had passed through adventures enough for a man's lifetime, he determined to settle there, and take up at last the profession of medicine from which he had, with so little profit, broken away. That is all his story, or so much of it as matters up to that night, 6 months later, when the Battle of Sedgemoor was fought. Deeming the impending action no affair of his, as indeed it was not, and indifferent to the activity with which Bridgewater was that night agog, Mr. Blood closed his ears to the sounds of it, and went early to bed. He was peacefully asleep long before 11 o'clock, at which hour, as you know, Monmouth rode but with his rebel host along the Bristol road, circuitously to avoid the marshland that lay between himself and the royal army. You also know that his numerical advantage, possibly counterbalanced by the greater steadiness of the regular troops on the other side, and the advantages he derived from falling by surprise upon an enemy that was more or less asleep, were all lost to him by blundering and bad leadership before ever he was at grips with Feversham. The armies came into collision in the neighborhood of 2 o'clock in the morning. Mr. Blood slept undisturbed through the distant boom of cannon. Not until 4 o'clock, when the sun was rising to dispel the last wisps of mist over the stricken field of battle, did he awaken from his tranquil slumbers. He sat up in bed, rubbed the sleep from his eyes, and collected himself. Blows were thundering upon the door of his house, and a voice was calling incoherently. This was the noise that had aroused him. Conceiving that he had to do with some urgent obstetrical case, he reached for bedgown and slippers to go below. On the landing he almost collided with Mrs. Barlow, new risen and unsightly, in a state of panic. He quieted her cluckings with a word of reassurance, and went himself to open. There, in slanting golden light of the new risen sun, stood a breathless, wild-eyed man and a steaming horse. Smothered in dust and grime, his clothes in disarray, the left sleeve of his doublet hanging in rags, this young man opened his lips to speak, yet for a long moment remained speechless. In that moment Mr. Blood recognized him for the young shipmaster, Jeremiah Pitt, the nephew of the maiden ladies opposite, one who had been drawn by the general enthusiasm into the vortex of that rebellion. The street was rousing, awakened by the sailors' noisy invasion. Doors were opening, and lattices were being unlatched for the protrusion of anxious, inquisitive heads. "Take your time now," said Mr. Blood. "I never knew speed made by overhaste." But the wild-eyed lad paid no heed to the admonition. He plunged headlong into speech, gasping, breathless. "It is Lord Gildoy," he panted. "He is sore wounded at Oglethorpe's farm by the river. I bore him thither, and he sent me for you. Come away, come away!" He would have clutched the doctor and hauled him forth by force in bedgown and slippers as he was, but the doctor eluded that too eager hand. "To be sure, I'll come," said he. He was distressed. Gildoy had been a very friendly, generous patron to him since his settling in these parts, and Mr. Blood was eager enough to do what he now could to discharge the debt, grieved that the occasion should have arisen, and in such a manner. For he knew quite well that the rash young nobleman had been an active agent of the Duke's. "To be sure, I'll come. But first give me leave to get some clothes and other things that I may need." "There's no time to lose." "Be easy now. I'll lose none. I'll tell ye again. Ye'll go quickest by going leisurely. Come in, take a chair." He threw open the door of the parlour. Young Pitt waved aside the invitation. "I'll wait here. Make haste, in God's name." Mr. Blood went off to dress and to fetch a case of instruments. Questions concerning the precise nature of Lord Gildoy's hurt could wait until they were on their way. Whilst he pulled on his boots, he gave Mrs. Barlow instructions for the day, which included the matter of a dinner he was not destined to eat. When at last he went forth again, Mrs. Barlow clucking after him like a disgruntled fowl, he found young Pitt smothered in a crowd of scared, half-dressed townsfolk, mostly women, who had come hastening for news of how the battle had sped. The news he gave them was to be read in the lamentations with which they disturbed the morning air. At sight of the doctor, dressed and booted, a case of instruments tucked under his arm, the messenger disengaged himself from those who pressed about, shook off his weariness and the two tearful aunts that clung most closely, and seizing the bridle of his horse, he climbed to the saddle. "Come along, sir," he cried. "Mount behind me." Mr. Blood, without wasting words, did as he was bidden. Pitt touched the horse with his spur. The little crowd gave way, and thus, upon the crupper of the doubly laden horse, clinging to the belt of his companion, Peter Blood set out upon his odyssey. For this Pitt, in whom he beheld no more than the messenger of a wounded rebel gentleman, was indeed the very messenger of fate. Chapter 2. Kirke's Dragoons. Oglethorpe's farm stood a mile or so to the south of Bridgewater, on the right bank of the river. It was a struggling Tudor building showing grey above the ivy that clothed its lower parts. Approaching it now, through the fragrant orchards, amid which it seemed to drowse in Arcadian peace beside the waters of the Parrett, sparkling in the morning sunlight, Mr. Blood might have had a difficulty in believing it part of a world tormented by strife and bloodshed. On the bridge, as they had been riding out of Bridgewater, they had met a vanguard of fugitives from the field of battle, weary, broken men, many of them wounded, all of them terror-stricken, staggering in speedless haste with the last remnants of their strength into the shelter which it was their vain illusion the town would afford them. Eyes glazed with latitude and fear looked up piteously out of haggard faces at Mr. Blood and his companion as they rode forth. Hoarse voices cried a warning that merciless pursuit was not far behind. Undeterred, however, young Pitt rode amain along the dusty road by which these poor fugitives from that swift rout of Sedgemoor came flocking in ever-increasing numbers. Presently he swung aside, and quitting the road took to a pathway that crossed the dewy meadowlands. Even here they met odd groups of these human derelicts, who were scattering in all directions, looking fearfully behind them as they came through the long grass, expecting at every moment to see the redcoats of the dragoons. But as Pitt's direction was the southward one, bringing them ever nearer to Feversham's headquarters, they were presently clear of that human flotsam and jetsam of the battle, and riding through the peaceful orchards heavy with the ripening fruit that was soon to make its annual yield of cider. At last they alighted on the kidney stones of the courtyard, and Baines, the master of the homestead, grave of countenance and flustered of manner, gave them welcome. In the spacious stone-flagged hall the doctor found Lord Gildoy, a very tall and dark young gentleman, prominent of chin and nose, stretched on a cane day-bed under one of the tall mullioned windows, in the care of Mrs. Baines and her comely daughter. His cheeks were leaden-hued, his eyes closed, and from his blue lips came with each laboured breath a faint moaning noise. Mr. Blood stood for a moment silently considering his patient. He deplored that a youth with such bright hopes in life as Lord Gildoy's should have risked all, perhaps existence itself, to forward the ambition of a worthless adventurer. Because he had liked and honoured this brave lad, he paid his case the tribute of a sigh. Then he knelt to his task, ripped away doublet and underwear to lay bare his lordship's mangled side, and called for water and linen, and what else he needed for his work. He was still intent upon it a half-hour later when the dragoons invaded the homestead. The clatter of hoofs and hoarse shouts that heralded their approach disturbed him not at all. For one thing, he was not easily disturbed. For another, his task absorbed him. But his lordship, who had now recovered consciousness, showed considerable alarm, and the blood-stained Jeremy Pitt sped to cover in a clothes-press. Baines was uneasy, and his wife and daughter trembled. Mr. Blood reassured them. "Why, what's to fear?" he said. "It's a Christian country. This and Christian men do not make war upon the wounded, nor upon those who harbour them." He still had, you see, illusions about Christians. He held a glass of cordial, prepared under his directions, to his lordship's lips. "Give your mind peace, my lord. The worst is done." And then they came rattling and clanking into the stone-flagged hall, a round dozen jack-booted, lobster-coated troopers of the Tangiers regiment, led by a sturdy black-browed fellow with the deal of gold lace about the breast of his coat. Baines stood his ground, his attitude half defiant, whilst his wife and daughter shrank away in renewed fear. Mr. Blood, at the head of the daybed, looked over his shoulder to take stock of the invaders. The officer barked an order which brought his men to an attentive halt, then swaggered forward, his clothed hand bearing down the pommel of his sword, his spurs jingling musically as he moved. He announced his authority to the yeoman. "I am Captain Hobart, of Colonel Kirke's dragoons. What rebels do you harbour?" The yeoman took alarm at that ferocious truculence. It expressed itself in his trembling voice. I am no harbourer of rebels, sir. This wounded gentleman, I could see for myself." The captain stamped forward to the daybed, and scowled down upon the grey-faced sufferer. "No need to ask how he came in this state and by his wounds. A damned rebel, and that's enough for me." He flung a command at his dragoons. "Out with them, lads." Mr. Blood got between the daybed and the troopers. "In the name of humanity, sir," said he on a note of anger, "this is England, not Tangiers. The gentleman is in sore case. He may not be moved without peril to his life." Captain Hobart was amused. "Oh, I am to be tender of the lives of these rebels? Odds blood, do you think it's to benefit his health we're taking him? There's gallows being planted along the road from Weston to Bridgewater, and he'll serve for one of them as well as another. Colonel Kirke'll learn these non-conforming oafs something they'll not forget in generations. You're hanging men without trial? Faith, then, it's mistaken I am. We're in Tangiers, after all, it seems, where your regiment belongs." The captain considered him with kindling eye. He looked over from the soles of his riding boots to the crown of his periwig. He noted the spare, active frame, the arrogant poise of the head, the air of authority that invested Mr. Blood. And soldier recognized soldier. The captain's eyes narrowed. Recognition went further. "Who the hell may you be?" he exploded. "My name is Blood, sir. Peter Blood, at your service." "Aye, aye, cod so. That's the name. You were in the French service once, were you not?" If Mr. Blood was surprised, he did not betray it. "I was." "Then I remember you. 5 years ago, or more, you were in Tangiers." "That is so. I knew your colonel." "Faith, you may be renewing the acquaintance." The captain laughed unpleasantly. "What brings you here, sir?" "This wounded gentleman. I was fetched to attend him. I am a medicus." "A doctor, you?" Scorn of that lie, as he conceived it, rang in the heavy, hectoring voice. "Medicani baccalaureus," said Mr. Blood. "Don't fling your French at me, man," snapped Hobart. "Speak English." Mr. Blood's smile annoyed him. "I am a physician practicing my calling in the town of Bridgewater." The captain sneered. "Which you reached by the way of Lynn Regis in the following of your bastard duke." It was Mr. Blood's turn to sneer. "If your wit were as big as your voice, my dear, it's the great man you'd be by this." For a moment the dragoon was speechless. The colour deepened in his face. "You may find me great enough to hang you." "Faith, yes. Ye've the look and the manners of the hangman. But if you practise your trade on my patient here, you may be putting a rope round your own neck. He's not the kind you may string up and no questions asked. He has the right to a trial, and the right to trial by his peers." By his peers? The captain was taken aback by these 3 words, which Mr. Blood had stressed. Sure, now, any but a fool or savage would ask his name before ordering him to the gallows. "The gentleman here is my Lord Gildoy." And then his lordship spoke for himself in a weak voice. "I make no concealment of my association with the Duke of Monmouth. I'll take the consequences, but if you please, I'll take them after trial, by my peers, as the doctor has said." The feeble voice ceased, and was followed by a moment's silence. As is common in many blustering men, there was a deal of timidity deep down in Hobart. The announcement of his lordship's rank had touched those depths. A servile upstart, he stood in awe of titles. And he stood in awe of his colonel. Percy Kirke was not lenient with blunderers. By a gesture he checked his men. He must consider. Mr. Blood, observing his pause, added further matter for his consideration. "He'll be remembering, Captain, that Lord Gildoy will have friends and relatives on the Tory side, who will have something to say to Colonel Kirke if his lordship should be handled like a common felon. Ye'll go warily, Captain, or, as I've said, it's a halter for your neck ye'll be weaving this morning." Captain Hobart swept the warning aside with a bluster of contempt, but he acted upon it none the less. "Take up the daybed," said he, "and convey him on that to Bridgewater. Lodge him in the gaol until I take order about him." "He may not survive the journey," Blood remonstrated. "He's in no case to be moved." "So much the worse for him. My affair is to round up rebels." He confirmed his order by a gesture. 2 of the men took up the daybed and swung to depart with it. Gildoy made a feeble effort to put forth a hand toward Mr. Blood. "Sir," he said, "you leave me in your debt. If I live, I shall study how to discharge it." Mr. Blood bowed for answer, then to the men. "Bear him steadily," he commanded. "His life depends on it." As the lordship was carried out, the captain became brisk. He turned upon the yeoman. "What other cursed rebels do you harbour?" "None other, sir. His lordship. We've dealt with his lordship for the present. We'll deal with you in a moment when we've searched your house. And by God, if you've lied to me—" He broke off, snarling to give an order. 4 of his dragoons went out. In a moment they were heard moving noisily in the adjacent room. Meanwhile the captain was questing about the hall, sounding the wainscoting with the butt of a pistol. Mr. Blood saw no profit to himself in lingering. "By your leave, it's a very good day I'll be wishing you," said he. "By my leave you'll remain a while," the captain ordered him. Mr. Blood shrugged and sat down. "You're tiresome," he said. "I wonder your colonel hasn't discovered it yet." But the captain did not heed him. He was stooping to pick up a soiled and dusty hat in which there was pinned a little bunch of oak leaves. It had been lying near the clothes press in which the unfortunate Pitt had taken refuge. The captain smiled malevolently. His eyes raked the room, resting first sardonically on the yeoman, then on the two women in the background, and finally on Mr. Blood, who sat with one leg thrown over the other in an attitude of indifference that was far from reflecting his mind. Then the captain stepped to the press, and pulled open one of the wings of its massive oaken door. He took the huddled inmate by the collar of his doublet, and lugged him out into the open. "And who the devil's this?" quoth he. "Another nobleman?" Mr. Blood had a vision of those gallows on which Captain Hobart had spoken, and of this unfortunate young shipmaster going to adorn one of them, strung up without trial, in the place of the other victim of whom the captain had been cheated. On the spot he invented not only a title, but a whole family for the young rebel. "Faith, you've said it, Captain. This is the Viscount Pitt, first cousin to Sir Thomas Vernon, who's married to the slut Moll Kirke, sister to your own colonel, and sometime lady-in-waiting upon King James's queen." Both the captain and his prisoner gasped, but whereas thereafter young Pitt discreetly held his peace, the captain raped out a nasty oath. He considered his prisoner again. "He's lying, is he not?" he demanded, seizing the lad by his shoulder, and glaring into his face. "He's rallying me, by God!" "If you believe that," said Blood, "hang him, and see what happens to you." The dragoon glared at the doctor, and then at his prisoner. "Pah!" He thrust the lad into the open hands of his men. "Fetch him along to Bridgewater, and make fast that fellow also." He pointed to Baines. "We'll show him what it means to harbor and comfort rebels." There was a moment of confusion. Baines struggled in the grip of the troopers, protesting vehemently. The terrified women screamed until silenced by a greater terror. The captain strode across to them. He took the girl by the shoulders. She was a pretty, golden-headed creature, with soft blue eyes that looked up entreatingly, piteously into the face of the dragoon. He leered upon her, his eyes aglow, took her chin in his hand, and set her shudderingly by his brutal kiss. "It's in earnest," he said, smiling grimly. "Let that quiet you, little rebel, till I've done with these rogues." And he swung away again, leaving her faint and trembling in the arms of her anguished mother. His men stood, grinning, awaiting orders. The two prisoners, now fast pinioned. "Take them away. Let Cornet Drake have charge of them." His smoldering eye again sought the cowering girl. "I'll stay a while, to search out this place. There may be other rebels hidden here." As an afterthought, he added, "And take this fellow with you." He pointed to Mr. Blood. "Bester." Mr. Blood started out his musings. He had been considering that in his case of instruments there was a lancet with which he might perform on Captain Hobart a beneficial operation. Beneficial, that is, to humanity. In any case, the dragoon was obviously plethoric, and would be the better for a bloodletting. The difficulty lay in making the opportunity. He was beginning to wonder if he could lure the captain aside with some tale of hidden treasure, and when this untimely interruption set a term to that interesting speculation, he sought to temporize. "Faith, it will suit me very well," said he, "for Bridgewater is my destination, and but that you've detained me, I'd have been on my way thither now." "Your destination there will be the Gaul." "Ah, bah, you're surely joking." "There's a gallows for you if you'd prefer it. It's merely a question of now or later." Rude hands seized Mr. Blood, and that prescient lancet was in the case on the table, out of reach. He twisted out the grip of the dragoons, for he was strong and agile, but they closed with him again immediately, bore him down. Pinning him to the ground, they tied his wrists behind his back, then roughly pulled him to his feet again. "Take him away," said Hobart shortly, and turned to issue his orders to the other waiting dragoons. "Go search the house, from attic to cellar, then report to me here." The soldiers trailed out by the door leading to the interior. Mr. Blood was thrust by his guards into the courtyard, where Pitt and Baines already waiting. From the threshold of the hall he looked back at Captain Hobart, and his sapphire eyes were blazing. On his lips trembled a threat of what he would do to Hobart if he should happen to survive this business. Betimes he remembered that to utter it were probably to extinguish his chance of living to execute it, for today the king's men were masters in the West, and the West was regarded an enemy country, to be subjected to the worst horror of war by the victorious side. Here a captain of horse was, for the moment, lord of life and death. Under the apple trees in the orchard, Mr. Blood and his companions in misfortune were made fast, each to a trooper's stirrup leather. Then, at the sharp order of the cornet, the little troop started for Bridgewater. As they set out, there was the fullest confirmation of Mr. Blood's hideous assumption that to the dragoons this was a conquered enemy country. There were sounds of rending timbers, of furniture smashed and overthrown, the shouts and laughter of brutal men, to announce that this hunt for rebels was no more than a pretext for pillage and destruction. Finally, above all other sounds, came the piercing screams of women in acutest agony. Baines checked in his stride, and swung round writhing, his face ashen. As a consequence, he was jerked from his feet by the rope that attached him to the stirrup leather, and he was dragged helplessly a yard or two before the trooper reined in, cursing him foully, and striking him with the flat of his sword. It came to Mr. Blood as he trudged forward under the laden apple trees on the fragrant, delicious July morning. That man, as he had long suspected, was the vilest work of God, and that only a fool would set himself up as a healer of a species that were best exterminated. Chapter 3. The Lord Chief Justice. It was not until 2 months later, on the 19th of September, if you must have an actual date, that Peter Blood was brought to trial upon a charge of high treason. We know that he was not guilty of this, but we need not doubt that he was quite capable of it by the time he was indicted. Those 2 months of inhuman, unspeakable imprisonment had moved his mind to a cold and deadly hatred of King James and his representatives. It says something for his fortitude that in all the circumstances he should still have a mind at all, and yet, terrible as was the position of this entirely innocent man, he had cause for thankfulness on 2 counts. The first of these was that he should have been brought to trial at all. The second, that his trial took place on the date named, and not a day earlier. In the very delay which exacerbated him lay, although he did not realize it, his only chance of avoiding the gallows. Easily, but for the favor of fortune, he might have been one of those hailed, on the morrow of the battle, more or less haphazard from the overflowing Gaul at Bridgewater, to be summarily hanged in the marketplace by the bloodthirsty Colonel Kirke. There was about the colonel of the Tangiers regiment a deadly dispatch, which might have disposed in like fashion of all those prisoners, numerous as they were, but for the vigorous intervention of the Bishop Muse, which put an end to the drumhead courts-martial. Even so, in that first week after Sedgemoor, Kirke and Feversham contrived between them to put to death over 100 men after a trial so summary as to be no trial at all. They required human freights for the gibbets, with which they were planting the countryside, and they little cared how they procured them or what innocent lives they took. What, after all, was the life of a clod? The executioners were kept busy with rope and chopper and cauldrons of pitch. I spare you the details of that nauseating picture. It is, after all, with the fate of Peter Blood that we are concerned rather than with that of the Monmouth rebels. He survived to be included in one of those melancholy droves of prisoners who, chained in pairs, were marched from Bridgewater to Taunton. Those who were too sorely wounded to march were conveyed in carts, into which they were brutally crowded, their wounds undressed and festering. Some were fortunate enough to die upon the way. When Blood insisted upon his right to exercise his art so as to relieve some of the suffering, he was accounted importunate and threatened with a flogging. If he had one regret now, it was that he had not been out with Monmouth. That, of course, was illogical, but you can hardly expect logic from a man in his position. His chain companion on that dreadful march was the same Jeremy Pitt who had been the agent of his present misfortunes. The young shipmaster had remained his close companion after their common arrest. Hence, fortuitously, had they been chained together in the crowded prison, where they were almost suffocated by the heat and the stench during those days of July, August, and September. Scraps of news filtered into the Gaul from the outside world. Some may have been deliberately allowed to penetrate. Of these were the tale of Monmouth's execution. It created profoundest dismay amongst the men who were suffering for the Duke and for the religious cause he had professed to champion. Many refused utterly to believe it. A wild story began to circulate that a man resembling Monmouth had offered himself up in the Duke's stead, and that Monmouth survived to come again in the glory to deliver Zion and make war upon Babylon. Mr. Blood heard that tale with the same indifference with which he had received the news of Monmouth's death. But one shameful thing he heard in connection with this, which left him not quite so unmoved, and served to nourish the contempt he was forming for King James. His Majesty had consented to see Monmouth. To have done so unless he intended to pardon him was a thing execrable and damnable beyond belief, for the only other object in granting that interview could be the evilly mean satisfaction of spurning the abject penitence of his unfortunate nephew. Later they heard that Lord Grey, who, after the Duke, indeed perhaps before him, was the main leader of the rebellion, had purchased his own pardon for £40,000. Peter Blood found this of a piece with the rest. His contempt for King James blazed out at last. "Why, here's a filthy mean creature to sit on a throne. If I had known as much of him before as I know to-day, I don't doubt I should have given cause to be where I am now." And then, on a sudden thought, "And where will Lord Gildoy be, do you suppose?" he asked. Young Pitt, whom he addressed, turned towards him a face from which the ruddy tan of the sea had faded almost completely during those months of captivity. His grey eyes were round and questioning. Blood answered him. "Sure, now, we've never seen his lordship since the day at Oglethorpe's. And where are the other gentry that were taken, the real leaders of this plaguey rebellion? Grey's case explains their absence, I think. They are wealthy men that can ransom themselves. Here awaiting the gallows are none but the unfortunates who followed. Those who had the honour to lead them go free. It's a curious and instructive reversal of the usual way of these things. Faith, it's an uncertain world entirely." He laughed and settled down into the spirit of scorn wrapped in which he stepped later into the great hall of Taunton Castle to take his trial. With him went Pitt and the yeoman Baines. The three of them were to be tried together, and their case was to open the proceedings of that ghastly day. The hall, even to the galleries, thronged with spectators, most of whom were ladies, was hung in scarlet, a pleasant conceit this, of the Lord Chief Justice's, who naturally enough preferred the colour that should reflect his own bloody mind. At the upper end, on a raised dais, sat the Lord Commissioners, the 5 judges in their scarlet robes and heavy dark periwigs, Baron Jeffreys of Wem enthroned in the middle place. The prisoners filed in under guard. The crier called for silence under pain of imprisonment, and, as the hum of voices gradually became hushed, Mr. Blood considered with interest the 12 good men and true that composed the jury. Neither good nor true did they look. They were scared, uneasy, and hangdog as any set of thieves caught with their hands in the pockets of their neighbours. They were 12 shaken men, each of whom stood between the sword of the Lord Chief Justice's recent bloodthirsty charge and the wall of his own conscience. From them Mr. Blood's calm, deliberate glance passed on to consider the Lords Commissioners, and particularly the presiding judge, the Lord Jeffreys, whose terrible fame had come ahead of him from Dorchester. He beheld a tall, slight man on the young side of 40, with an oval face that was delicately beautiful. There were dark stains of suffering or sleeplessness under the low-lidded eyes, heightening their brilliance and their gentle melancholy. The face was very pale, save for the vivid colour of the full lips and the hectic flush on the rather high but inconspicuous cheekbones. It was something in those lips that marred the perfection of the countenance. A fault elusive but undeniable lurked there to beguile the fine sensitiveness of those nostrils, and the tenderness of those dark liquid eyes, and the noble calm of that pale brow. The physician and Mr. Blood regarded the man with peculiar interest, knowing as he did the agonizing malady from which his lordship suffered, and the amazing irregular debauched life that he led in spite of it. perhaps because of it. "Peter Blood, hold up your hand." Abruptly he was recalled to his position by the harsh voice of the clerk of the arraigns. His obedience was mechanical, and the clerk droned out the wordy indictment which pronounced Peter Blood a false traitor against the most illustrious and most excellent Prince James II, by the grace of God, of England, Scotland, France, and Ireland, King, his supreme and natural Lord. It informed him that, having no fear of God in his heart, but being moved and seduced by the instigation of the devil, he had failed in the love and true and due natural obedience towards his said Lord the King, and had moved to disturb the peace and tranquillity of the kingdom, and to stir up war and rebellion, to depose his said Lord the King from the title, honor, and the regal name of the imperial crown, and much more of the same kind, at the end of which he was invited to say whether he was guilty or not guilty. He answered more than was asked. "It's entirely innocent I am." A small, sharp-faced man at a table before and to the right of him bounced up. It was Mr. Pollexfen, the judge advocate. "Are you guilty or not guilty?" snapped this peppery gentleman. "You must take the words." "Words, is it?" said Peter Blood. "Oh, not guilty." And he went on, addressing himself to the bench. "On this same subject of words, may it please your lordships, I am guilty of nothing to justify any of those words I have heard used to describe me, unless it be of want of patience at having been closely confined for 2 months and longer in a fetid gaol, with great peril to my health and even life." Being started, he would have addressed a deal more, but at this point the Lord Chief Justice interposed in a gentle, rather plaintive voice. "Look at you, sir. Because you must observe the common and usual methods of trial, I must interrupt you now. You are no doubt ignorant of the forms of law." "Not only ignorant, my lord, but hitherto most happy in that ignorance. I could gladly have foregone this acquaintance with them." A pale smile momentarily lightened the wistful countenance. "I believe you. You shall be fully heard when you come to your defense. But anything you say now is altogether irregular and improper." And heartened by the apparent sympathy and consideration, Mr. Blood answered thereafter, as was required of him, that he would be tried by God and his country. Whereupon, having prayed to God to send him a good deliverance, the clerk called upon Andrew Baines to hold up his hand and plead. From Baines, who pleaded not guilty, the clerk passed on to Pitt, who boldly owned his guilt. The Lord Chief Justice stirred at that. "Come, that's better," quoth he, and his 4 scarlet brethren nodded. If all were as abstinent as his 2 fellow rebels, there would never be an end. After that ominous interpellation, delivered with an inhuman iciness that sent a shiver through the court, Mr. Pollexfen got to his feet. With great prolixity he stated the general case against the 3 men, and the particular case against Peter Blood, whose indictment was to be taken first. The only witness called for the king was Captain Hobart. He testified briskly to the manner in which he had found and taken the 3 prisoners, together with Lord Gildoy. Upon the orders of his colonel he would have hanged Pitt out of hand, but was restrained by the lies of the prisoner Blood, who led him to believe that Pitt was a peer of the realm and a person of consideration. As the captain's evidence concluded, Lord Jeffreys looked across at Peter Blood. "Will the prisoner Blood ask the witness any questions?" "None, my lord. He has correctly related what occurred." "I am glad to have your admission of that without any of the prevarications that are usual in your kind. And I will say this, that here prevarication would avail you little, for we always have the truth in the end. Be sure of that." Baines and Pitt admitted the accuracy of the captain's evidence, whereupon the scarlet figure of the Lord Chief Justice heaved a sigh of relief. "This being so, let us go on, in God's name, for we have much to do." There was now no trace of gentleness in his voice. It was brisk and rasping, and the lips through which it passed were curved in scorn. "I take it, Mr. Pollexfen, that the wicked treason of these 3 rogues being established, indeed admitted by them, there is no more to be said?" Peter Blood's voice rang out crisply. on a note that almost seemed to contain laughter. "May it please your lordship, but there's a deal more to be said." His lordship looked at him, first in blank amazement at his audacity, then gradually with an expression of dull anger. The scarlet lips fell into unpleasant curl lines that transfigured the whole countenance. "How now, rogue? Would you waste our time with idle subterfuge?" "I would have your lordship and the gentlemen of the jury hear me on my defence, as your lordship promised that I should be heard." "Why, so you shall, villain, so you shall." His lordship's voice was harsh as a file. He writhed as he spoke, and for an instant his features were distorted. A delicate dead white hand, on which the veins showed blue, brought forth a handkerchief, with which he dabbed his lips and then his brow. Observing him with his physician's eye, Peter Blood judged him a prey to the pain of the disease that was destroying him. "So you shall. But after the admission made, what defence remains?" "You shall judge, my lord. That is the purpose for which I sit here. And so shall you, gentlemen." Blood looked from judge to jury. The latter shifted uncomfortably under the confident flash of his blue eyes. Lord Geoffrey's bullying charge had whipped the spirit out of them. Had they, themselves, been prisoners accused of treason, he could not have arraigned them more ferociously. Peter Blood stood boldly forward, erect, self-possessed, and saturnine. He was freshly shaved, and his periwig, if out of curl, was at least carefully combed and dressed. "Captain Hobart has testified to what he knows, that he found me at Oglethorpe's farm on the Monday morning after the battle at Weston. But he has not told you what I did there." Again the judge broke in. "Why, what should you have been doing there in the company of rebels, two of whom, Lord Gildoy and your fellow there, have already admitted their guilt?" "That is what I beg leave to tell your lordship." "I pray you do, and in God's name be brief, man, for if I am to be troubled with the say of all you traitor dogs, I may sit here until the spring is eyes." "I was there, my lord, in my quality as a physician, to dress Lord Gildoy's wounds." "What's this? Do you tell me you are a physician?" "A graduate of Trinity College, Dublin." "Good God!" cried Lord Jeffreys, his voice suddenly swelling, his eyes upon the jury. "What an impudent rogue is this! You heard the witness say that he had known him in Tangiers some years ago, and that he was then an officer in the French service. You heard the prisoner admit that the witness had spoken the truth?" "Why, so he had. Yet what I am telling you is also true. So it is. For some years I was a soldier, but before that I was a physician, and I have been once again since January last, established in Bridgewater, as I can bring 100 witnesses to prove." "There's not the need to waste our time with that. I will convict you out of your own rascally mouth. I will ask you only this. How came you, who represent yourself as a physician peacefully following your calling in the town of Bridgewater, to be within the army of the Duke of Monmouth?" "I was never with that army. No witness has sworn to that. I dare swear that no witness will. I never was attracted to the late rebellion. I regarded the adventure as a wicked madness. I take leave to ask your lordship—" His brogue became more marked than ever. "What should I, who was born and bred a Papist, be doing in the army of the Protestant champion?" "A Papist, thou?" The judge gloomed on him a moment. "Art more like a snivelling, canting Jack Presbyter. I tell you, man, I can smell a Presbyterian 40 miles. "Then I'll take leave to marvel that with so keen a nose your lordship can't smell a Papist at 4 paces." There was a ripple of laughter in the galleries, instantly quelled by the fierce glare of the judge and the voice of the crier. Lord Jeffreys leaned farther forward upon his desk. He raised that delicate white hand, still clutching its handkerchief, and sprouting from a froth of lace. "We'll leave your rebellion out of the account for the moment, friend," said he. "But mark what I say to you." With a minatory forefinger he beat the time of his words. "Know, friend, that there is no religion a man can pretend to give a countenance to lying. Thou hast a precious immortal soul, and there is nothing in the world equal to it in value. Consider that the great God of heaven and earth, before whose tribunal thou and we and all persons are to stand at the last day, will take vengeance on thee for every falsehood, and justly strike thee in eternal flames, make thee drop into the bottomless pit of fire and brimstone, if thou offer to deviate the least from the truth, and nothing but the truth. For I tell thee God is not mocked. On that I charge you to answer truthfully. How come you be taken with these rebels? Peter Blood gaped at him a moment in consternation. The man was incredible, unreal, fantastic, a nightmare judge. Then he collected himself to answer. I was summoned that morning to succour Lord Gildoy, and I conceived it to be the duty imposed upon me by my calling to answer that summons. Did you so? The judge, terrible now of aspect, his face white, his twisted lips red as the blood for which they thirsted, glared upon him in evil mockery. Then he controlled himself as if by an effort. He sighed. He resumed his earlier gentle plaintiveness. Lord, how you waste our time! But I'll have patience with you. Who summoned you? Master Pitt there, as he will testify. Oh, Master Pitt will testify. He that is himself a traitor self-confessed. Is that your witness? There is also Master Baines here, who can answer to it. Good Master Baines will have to answer for himself, and I doubt not he'll be greatly exercised to save his own neck from a halter. Come, come, sir, are these your only witnesses? I could bring others from Bridgewater who saw me set out that morning upon the crupper of Master Pitt's horse. His lordship smiled. It will not be necessary, for mark me, I do not intend to waste more time on you. Answer me only this. When Master Pitt, as you pretend, came to summon you, did you know that he had been, as you have heard him confess, of Monmouth's following? I did, my lord. You did! Ha! His lordship looked at the cringing jury and uttered a short stabbing laugh. Yet in spite of that you went with him? To succour a wounded man, as was my sacred duty. Thy sacred duty, sayest thou? Fury blazed out of him again. Good God, what a generation of vipers do we live in! Thy sacred duty, rogue, is to thy king and to God. But let it pass. Did he tell you whom it was that you were desired to succour? Lord Gildoy, yes. And you knew that Lord Gildoy had been wounded in the battle, and on that side he fought? I knew. And yet, being, as you would have us believe, a true and loyal subject of our lord the king, you went to succour him. Peter Blood lost patience for a moment. My business, my lord, was with his wounds, not with his politics. A murmur from the galleries, and even from the jury, approved him. It served only to drive his terrible judge into a deeper fury. Jesus God, was there ever such an impudent villain in the world as thou? He swung, white-faced, to the jury. I hope, gentlemen of the jury, you take notice of the horrible carriage of this traitor rogue, and withal you cannot but observe the spirit of this sort of people. What a villainous and devilish one it is! Out of his own mouth he has said enough to hang him a dozen times. Yet is there more? Answer me this, sir. When you cozened Captain Hobart with your lies concerning the station of this other traitor Pitt, what was your business then? To save him from being hanged without trial, as was threatened. What concern was it of yours whether or how the wretch was hanged? Justice is the concern of every loyal subject, for an injustice committed by one who holds the king's commission is in some sense a dishonour to the king's majesty. It was a shrewd, sharp thrust aimed at the jury, and it reveals, I think, the alertness of the man's mind, his self-possession ever steadiest in moments of dire peril. With any other jury it must have made the impression that he hoped to make. It may even have made its impression upon these poor pusillanimous sheep. But the dread judge was there to efface it. He gasped aloud, then flung himself violently forward. Lord of heaven, he stormed, was there ever such a canting, impudent rascal? But I have done with you. I see thee, villain, I see thee already with a halter round thy neck. Having spoken so, gloatingly, evilly, he sank back again, and composed himself. It was as if a curtain fell. All emotion passed again from his pale face. Back to invest it again came that gentle melancholy. Speaking after a moment's pause, his voice was soft, almost tender, yet every word of it carried sharply through that hushed court. If I know my own heart, it is not in my nature to desire the hurt of anybody. much less to delight in their eternal perdition. It is out of compassion for you that I have used all these words, because I would have you have some regard for your immortal soul, and not ensure its damnation by obdurantly persisting in falsehood and prevarication. But I see that all the pains in the world, and all compassion and charity are lost upon you, and therefore I will say no more to you. He turned again to the jury that countenance of wistful beauty. Gentlemen, I must tell you for law, of which we are the judges, and not you, that if any person be in actual rebellion against the king, and against another person, who really and actually was not in rebellion, does knowingly receive, harbor, comfort, or succor him, such a person is as much a traitor as he who indeed bore him. We are bound by our oaths and consciences to declare to you what is law, and you are bound by your oaths and your consciousness to deliver and to declare to us by your verdict the truth of the facts. Upon that he proceeded to his summing up, showing how Baines and Blood were both guilty of treason, the first for having harbored a traitor, the second for having succored that traitor by dressing his wounds. He interlarded his address by sycophantic allusions to his natural lord and lawful sovereign, the king, whom God had sent over them, and with vituperations of nonconformity and of Monmouth, of whom, in his own words, he dared boldly affirm that the meanest subject within the kingdom that was of legitimate birth had a better title to the crown. Jesus God, that ever we should have such a generation of vipers among us! He burst out in rhetorical frenzy, and then he sank back, as if exhausted by the violence he had used. A moment he was still, dabbing his lips again. Then he moved uneasily. Once more his features were twisted by pain, and in a few snarling, almost incoherent words, he dismissed the jury to consider the verdict. Peter Blood had listened to the intemperate, the blasphemous, and almost obscene invective of that tirade with a detachment that afterwards, in retrospect, surprised him. He was so amazed by the man, by the reactions taking place in him between mind and body, and by his methods of bullying and coercing the jury into bloodshed, that he almost forgot that his own life was at stake. The absence of that dazed jury was a brief one. The verdict found the 3 prisoners guilty. Peter Blood looked round the scarlet-hung court. For an instant that foam of white faces seemed to heave before him. Then he was himself again, and a voice was asking him what he had to say for himself, why sentence of death should not be passed upon him, being convicted of high treason. He laughed, and his laugh jarred uncannily upon the deathly stillness of the court. It was all so grotesque, such a mockery of justice administered by that wistful-eyed jack-pudding in scarlet, who was himself a mockery, the venial instrument of a brutally spiteful and vindictive king. His laughter shocked the austerity of that same jack-pudding. Do you laugh, sirrah, with the rope about your neck, upon the very threshold of that eternity you are so suddenly to enter into? And then Blood took his revenge. Faith, it's in better case I am for mirth than your lordship, for I have this to say before you deliver judgment. Your lordship sees me, an innocent man whose only offence is that I practice charity, with a halter around my neck. Your lordship, being the justicar, speaks with knowledge of what is to come to me. I, being a physician, may speak with knowledge of what is to come to your lordship, and I tell you that I would not now change places with you, that I would not exchange this halter that you fling about my neck with the stone that you carry in your body. The death with which you may doom me is a pleasantry by contrast with the death to which your lordship has been doomed by that great judge with whose name your lordship makes so free. The Lord Chief Justice sat stillfully upright, his face ashen, his lips twitching, and whilst you might have counted 10, there was no sound in that paralyzed court after Peter Blood had finished speaking. All those who knew Lord Jeffreys regarded this as the lull before the storm, and braced themselves for the explosion. But none came. Slowly, faintly, the colour crept back into that ashen face. The scarlet figure lost its rigidity, and bent forward. His lordship began to speak. In a muted voice, and briefly, much more briefly than his wont on such occasions, and in the matter entirely mechanical, the manner of a man whose thoughts are elsewhere while his lips are speaking, he delivered sentence of death in the prescribed form, and without the least allusion to what Peter Blood had said. Having delivered it, he sank back exhausted, his eyes half closed, his brow agleam with sweat. The prisoners filed out. Mr. Pollexfen, a Whig at heart despite the position of judge advocate which he occupied, was overheard by one of the jurors to mutter in the ear of a brother counsel, "On my soul, that swarthy rascal has given his lordship a scare. It's a pity he must hang, for a man who can frighten Jeffreys should go far." Chapter 4. Human Merchandise. Mr. Pollexfen was at one and the same time right and wrong, a condition much more common than is generally supposed. He was right in his indifferently expressed thought that a man whose mien and words could daunt such a lord of terror as Jeffreys should by the dominance of his nature be able to fashion himself a considerable destiny. He was wrong, though justifiably so, in his assumption that Peter Blood must hang. I have said that the tribulations with which he was visited as a result of his errand of mercy to Oglethorpe's farm contained, although as yet he did not perceive it, perhaps, two sources of thankfulness. One, that he was tried at all, the other that his trial took place on the 19th of September. Until the 18th, the sentences passed by the court of the Lords Commissioners had been carried out literally and expeditiously. But on the morning of the 19th there arrived at Taunton a courier from Lord Sunderland, the Secretary of State, with a letter for Lord Jeffreys, wherein he was informed that His Majesty had been graciously pleased to command the 1100 rebels should be furnished for transportation to some of His Majesty's southern plantations, Jamaica, Barbados, or any of the Leeward Islands. You are not to suppose that this command was dictated by any sense of mercy. Lord Churchill was no more than just when he spoke of the king's heart as being as insensible as marble. It had been realized that in these wholesale hangings there was taking place a reckless waste of valuable material. Slaves were urgently required in the plantations, and a healthy, vigorous man could be reckoned worth at least from 10 to 15 pounds. Then there were at court many gentlemen who had some claim or other upon His Majesty's bounty. Here was a cheap and ready way to discharge these claims. From amongst the convicted rebels a certain number might be set aside to be bestowed upon those gentlemen, so that they might dispose of them to their own profit. My Lord Sunderland's letter gives precise details of the royal munificence in human flesh. 1,000 prisoners were to be distributed among some 8 courtiers and others, whilst a postscriptum to his lordship's letter asked for a further 100 to be held at the disposal of the Queen. These prisoners were to be transported at once to His Majesty's southern plantations, and to be kept there for the space of 10 years before being restored to liberty, the parties to whom they were assigned entering into security to see the transportation was immediately effected. We know from Lord Jeffreys' secretary how the Lord Chief Justice inveighed that night in drunken frenzy against this misplaced clemency to which His Majesty had been persuaded. We know how he attempted by letter to induce the king to reconsider his decision, but James adhered to it. It was, apart from the indirect profit he derived from it, a clemency full worthy of him. He knew that to spare lives in this fashion was to convert them into living deaths. Many must succumb to torment to the horrors of West Indian slavery, and so be the envy of their surviving companions. Thus it happened that Peter Blood, and with him Jeremy Pitt and Andrew Baines, instead of being hanged, drawn, and quartered as their sentences directed, were conveyed to Bristol, and there shipped with some 50 others aboard the Jamaican merchant. From close confinement under hatches, ill nourishment, and foul water, a sickness broke out amongst them, of which 11 died. Amongst these was the unfortunate yeoman from Oglethorpe's farm, brutally torn from his quiet homestead amid the fragrant cider orchards, for no other sin but that he had practised mercy. The mortality might have been higher than it was but for Peter Blood. At first the master of the Jamaica merchant had answered with oaths and threats the doctor's expostulations against permitting men to perish in this fashion, and his insistence that he should be made free of the medicine chest and given leave to minister to the sick. but presently Captain Gardner came to see that he might be brought to task for these too heavy losses of human merchandise, and because of this he was belatedly glad to avail himself of the skill of Peter Blood. The doctor went to work zealously and zestfully, and wrought so ably that, by his ministrations and by improving the condition of his fellow captives, he checked the spread of the disease. Towards the middle of December, the Jamaica Merchant dropped anchor in Carlisle Bay, and put ashore the 42 surviving rebel convicts. If these unfortunates had imagined, as many of them appear to have done, that they were coming into some wild savage country, the prospect of which they had a glimpse before they were hustled over the ship's side into the waiting boats was enough to correct the impression. They beheld a town of sufficiently imposing proportions, composed of houses built upon European notions of architecture, but without any of the huddle usual in European cities. The spire of a church rose dominantly above the red roofs. A fort guarded the entrance of the wide harbour, with guns thrusting their muzzles between the crenels, and the wide facade of Government House revealed itself dominantly placed on a gentle hill above the town. This hill was vividly green, as is an English hill in April, and the day was such a day as April gives to England, the season of heavy rains being newly ended. On a wide cobbled space on the sea front they found a guard of red-coated militia drawn up to receive them, and a crowd, attracted by their arrival, which in dress and manner differed little from a crowd in a seaport at home, save that it contained fewer women and a greater number of negroes. To inspect them, drawn up there on the mole, came Governor Steed, a short, stout, red-faced gentleman, in blue taffetas burdened by a prodigious amount of gold lace, who limped a little and leaned heavily upon a stout ebony cane. After him, in the uniform of a colonel of the Barbados militia, rolled a tall, corpulent man who towered head and shoulder above the governor, with malevolence plainly written on his enormous yellowish countenance. At his side, and contrasting oddly with his grossness, moving with an easy stripling grace, came a slight young lady in a modish riding gown. The broad brim of a grey hat was a scarlet sweep of ostrich plumes, shaded an oval face upon which the climate of the Tropic of Cancer had made no impression. So delicately fair was its complexion. Ringlets of red-brown hair hung to her shoulders. Frankness looked out from her hazel eyes, which were set wide. Commiseration repressed now the mischievousness that normally inhabited her fresh young mouth. Peter Blood caught himself staring in a sort of amazement at that piquant face, which seemed here so out of place, and finding his stare returned, he shifted uncomfortably. He grew conscious of that sorry figure that he cut, unwashed, with rank and matted hair and a disfiguring black beard upon his face, and the erstwhile splendid suit of black camlet in which he had been taken prisoner, now reduced to rags that would have disgraced a scarecrow. He was in no case for inspection by such dainty eyes as these. Nevertheless, they continued to inspect him with round eye, almost childlike wonder and pity. Their owner put forth a hand to touch the scarlet sleeve of her companion, whereupon with an ill-tempered grunt the man swung his great bulk round so that he directly confronted her. Looking up into his face, she was speaking to him earnestly, but the colonel plainly gave her no more than the half of his attention. His little beady eyes, closely flanking a fleshy, pendulous nose, had passed from her and were fixed upon fair-haired, sturdy young Pitt, who was standing beside Blood. The governor had also come to a halt, and for a moment now that little group of three stood in conversation. What the lady said, Peter could not hear at all, for she lowered her voice. The colonel's reached him in a confused rumble, but the governor was neither considerate nor indistinct. He had a high-pitched voice which carried far, and believing himself witty, he desired to be heard by all. "But, my dear Colonel Bishop, it is for you to take first choice from this dainty nosegay, and at your own price. After that we'll send the rest to auction." Colonel Bishop nodded his acknowledgment. He raised his voice in answering, "Your Excellency is very good, but faith, they're a weedy lot, not likely to be much value in the plantation." His beady eyes scanned them again, and his contempt of them deepened the malevolence of his face. It was as if he were annoyed with them for being in no better condition. Then he beckoned forward Captain Gardner, the master of the Jamaica Merchant, and for some minutes stood and talked with him over a list which the latter produced at his request. Presently he waved aside the list and advanced alone towards the rebels' convict. His eyes considering them, his lips pursed. Before the young Somersetshire shipmaster he came to a halt, and stood an instant pondering him. Then he fingered the muscle of the young man's arm, and bade him open his mouth that he might see his teeth. He pursed his coarse lips again, and nodded. He spoke to Gardner over his shoulder. £15 for this one. The captain made a face of dismay. £15? It is not half what I meant to ask for him. It is double what I had meant to give, grunted the colonel. But he would be cheap at £30, your honour. I can't get a negro for that. These white swine don't live. They're not fit for the labour. Gardner broke into protestations of Pitt's health, youth, and vigour. It was not a man he was discussing. It was a beast of burden. Pitt, a sensitive lad, stood mute and unmoving. Only the ebb and flow of colour in his cheeks showed the inward struggle by which he maintained his self-control. Peter Blood was nauseated by the loathsome haggle. In the background, moving slowly away down the line of prisoners, went the lady in conversation with the governor, who smirked and preened himself as he limped beside her. She was unconscious of the loathly business the colonel was transacting. Was she, wondered Blood, indifferent to it? Colonel Bishop swung on his heel to pass on. I'll go as far as £20, not a penny more, and it's twice as much as you are like to get from Crabston. Captain Gardner, recognizing the finality of the tone, sighed and yielded. Already Bishop was moving down the line. For Mr. Blood, as for a weedy youth on his left, the colonel had no more than a glance of contempt. But the next man, a middle-aged colossus named Wolverstone, who had lost an eye at Sedgemoor, drew his regard, and the haggling was recommenced. Peter Blood stood there in the brilliant sunshine and inhaled the fragrant air, which was unlike any air that he had ever breathed. It was laden with a strange perfume, blend of logwood flower, pimento, and aromatic cedars. He lost himself in unprofitable speculations born of that singular fragrance. He was in no mood for conversation, nor was Pitt, who stood dumbly at his side, and who was afflicted mainly at the moment by the thought that he was at last to be separated from this man with whom he had stood shoulder to shoulder throughout all these troublous months, and whom he had come to love and depend upon for guidance and sustenance. A sense of loneliness and misery pervaded him by contrast with which all that he had endured seemed as nothing. To Pitt, this separation was the poignant climax of all his sufferings. Other buyers came and stared at them and passed on. Blood did not heed them. And then, at the end of the line, there was a movement. Gardner was speaking in a loud voice, making an announcement to the general public of buyers that had waited until Colonel Bishop had taken his choice of that human merchandise. As he finished, Blood, looking in his direction, noticed that the girl was speaking to Bishop, and pointing up the line with a silver-hilted riding whip she carried. Bishop shaded his eyes with his hand to look in the direction in which she was pointing. Then slowly, with his ponderous, rolling gait, he approached again, accompanied by Gardner, and followed by the lady and the governor. On they came until the colonel was abreast of Blood. He would have passed on, but the lady tapped his arm with her whip. "But this is the man I meant," she said. "This one?" Contempt rang in the voice. Peter Blood found himself staring into a pair of beady brown eyes sunk into a yellow, fleshy face like currants into a dumpling. He felt the colour creeping into his face under the insult of that contemptuous inspection. "Bah! A bag of bones! What should I do with him?" He was turning away when Gardner interposed. "He may be lean, but he's tough and healthy. When half of them was sick and the other half sickening, this rogue kept his legs and doctored his fellows. But for him there'd have been more deaths than there was. Say £15 for him, Colonel. That's cheap enough. He's tough, I'll tell your honour, tough and strong, though he be lean, and he's just a man to bear the heat when it comes. The climate'll never kill him." There came a chuckle from Governor Steed. "You hear, Colonel? Trust your niece. Her sex knows a man when it sees one." And he laughed, well pleased with his wit. But he laughed alone. A cloud of annoyance swept across the face of the colonel's niece, whilst the colonel himself was too absorbed in the consideration of this bargain to heed the governor's humour. He twisted his lip a little, stroking his chin with his hand the while. Jeremy Pitt had almost ceased to breathe. "I'll give you £10 for him," said the colonel at last. Peter Blood prayed that the offer might be rejected, for no reason that he could have given you. He was taken with repugnance at the thought of becoming the property of this gross animal, and in some sort the property of that hazel-eyed young girl. But it would need more than repugnance to save him from his destiny. A slave is a slave, and has no power to shape his fate. Peter Blood was sold to Colonel Bishop, a disdainful buyer, for the ignominious sum of £10. Chapter 5. Arabella Bishop. One sunny morning in January, about a month after the arrival of the Jamaica merchant at Bridgetown, Miss Arabella Bishop rode out from her uncle's fine house on the heights to the northwest of the city. She was attended by 2 negroes who trotted after her at a respectable distance, and her destination was Government House, whither she went to visit the governor's lady, who had lately been ailing. Reaching the summit of a gentle, grassy slope, she met a tall, lean man dressed in a sober, gentlemanly fashion, who was walking in the opposite direction. He was a stranger to her, and strangers were rare enough in the island. And yet, in some vague way, he did not seem quite a stranger. Miss Arabella drew rein, affecting to pause that she might admire the prospect, which was fair enough to warrant it. Yet out of the corner of those hazel eyes she scanned this fellow very attentively as he came nearer. She corrected her first impression of his dress. It was sober enough, but hardly gentlemanly. Coat and breeches were of plain homespun, and if the former sat so well upon him, it was more by virtue of his natural grace than by that of tailoring. His stockings were of cotton, harsh and plain, and the broad castor, which he respectfully doffed as he came up with her, was an old one, unadorned by band or feather. What seemed to be a periwig at a little distance was now revealed for the man's own lustrous, coiling black hair. Out of a brown, shaven, saturnine face, 2 eyes that were startlingly blue considered her gravely. The man would have passed on, but that she detained him. "I think I know you, sir," said she. Her voice was crisp and boyish, and there was something of boyishness in her manner, if one can apply the term to so dainty a lady. It arose perhaps from an ease or directness which disdained the artifices of her sex, and set her on good terms with all the world. To this it may be due that Miss Arabella had reached the age of 25, not merely unmarried but unwooed. She used with all men a sisterly frankness, which in itself contains a quality of aloofness, rendering it difficult for any man to become her lover. Her negroes had halted at some distance in the rear, and they squatted now upon the short grass until it should be her pleasure to proceed upon her way. The stranger came to a standstill upon being addressed. "A lady should know her own property," said he. "My property? Your uncle's, leastways. Let me present myself. I am called Peter Blood, and I am worth precisely £10. I know it because that is the sum your uncle paid for me. It is not every man has the same opportunities of ascertaining his real value." She recognized him then. She had not seen him since that day upon the mole a month ago, and that she should not instantly have known him again despite the interest he had then aroused in her is not surprising, considering the change he had wrought in his appearance, which now was hardly that of a slave. "My God," said she, "and you can laugh." "It's an achievement," he admitted, "but then I have not fared as ill as I might." "I have heard of that," said she. What she had heard was that this rebel convict had been discovered to be a physician. The thing had come to the ears of Governor Steed, who suffered damnably from the gout, and Governor Steed had borrowed the fellow from his purchaser. Whether by skill or good fortune, Peter Blood had afforded the governor that relief which his excellency had failed to obtain from the ministrations of either of the 2 physicians practising in Bridgetown. Then the governor's lady had desired him to attend her for the megrims. Mr. Blood had found her suffering from nothing worse than peevishness, the result of a natural petulance aggravated by the dullness of life in Barbados to a lady of her social aspirations. But he had prescribed for her none the less, and she had conceived herself the better for his prescription. After that the fame of him had gone through Bridgetown, and Colonel Bishop had found there was more profit to be made out of this new slave by leaving him to pursue his profession than by setting him to work on the plantations for which purpose he had been originally acquired. "It is yourself, madam, I have to thank for my comparatively easy and clean condition," said Mr. Blood. "And I am glad to take this opportunity of doing so." The gratitude was in his words rather than in his tone. Was he mocking, she wondered, and looked at him with the searching frankness that another might have found disconcerting. He took the glance for a question, and answered it. "If some other planter had bought me," he explained, "it is odds that the facts of my shining abilities might never have been brought to light, and I should be hewing and hoeing at this moment like the poor wretches who were landed with me." "And why do you thank me for that? It is my uncle who bought you." "But he would not have done so had you not urged him. I perceived your interest. At the time I resented it." "You resented it?" There was a challenge in her boyish voice. "I have had no lack of experiences of this mortal life, but to be bought and sold was a new one, and I was hardly in the mood to love my purchaser." "If I urged you upon my uncle, sir, it was that I commiserated you." There was a slight severity in her tone, as if to reprove the mixture of mockery and flippancy in which he seemed to be speaking. She proceeded to explain herself. "My uncle may appear to you a hard man. No doubt he is. They are all hard men, these planters. It is the life, I suppose. But there are others here who are worse. There is Mr. Crabston, for instance, up at Speightstown. He was there on the mole, waiting to buy my uncle's leavings, and if you had fallen into his hands, a dreadful man. That is why." He was a little bewildered. "This interest in a stranger," he began, then changed the direction of his probe. "But there were others as deserving of commiseration." "You do not seem quite like the others." "I am not," said he. "Oh." She stared at him, bridling a little. "You have a good opinion of yourself." "On the contrary, the others are all worthy rebels. I am not. That is the difference. I was the one who had not the wit to see that England requires purifying. I was content to pursue a doctor's trade in Bridgewater, whilst my betters were shedding their blood to drive out an unclean tyrant and his rascally crew." "Sir," she checked him, "I think you are talking treason." "I hope I am not obscure," said he. "There are those here who would have you flogged if they heard you." "The governor would never allow it. He has the gout, and his lady has the megrims." "Do you depend upon that?" She was frankly scornful. "You have certainly never had the gout, probably not even the megrims," said he. She made a little impatient movement with her hand, and looked away from him a moment out to sea. Quite suddenly she looked at him again, and now her brows were knit. "But if you are not a rebel, how come you here?" He saw the thing she apprehended, and he laughed. "Faith now, it's a long story," said he. "And one perhaps that you would prefer not to tell?" Briefly on that he told it to her. "My God, what an infamy!" she cried when he had done. "Oh, it's a sweet country, England, under King James. There's no need to commiserate me further. All things considered, I prefer Barbados. Here at least one can believe in God." He looked first to right, then to left as he spoke. From the distant, shadowy bulk of Mount Hilbay to the limitless ocean ruffled by the winds of heaven. Then, as if the fair prospect rendered him conscious of his own littleness and the insignificance of his woes, he fell thoughtful. "Is that so difficult elsewhere?" she asked him, and she was very grave. "Men make it so." "I see." She laughed a little, on a note of sadness, it seemed to him. "I have never deemed Barbados the earthly mirror of heaven," she confessed, "but no doubt you know your world better than I." She touched her horse with her little silver-hilted whip. "I congratulate you on this easing of your misfortunes." He bowed, and she moved on. Her negroes sprang up and went trotting after her. A while Peter Blood remained standing there, where she had left him, conning the sunlight waters of Carlisle Bay below, and the shipping in that spacious haven about which the gulls were fluttering noisily. It was a fair enough prospect, he reflected, but it was a prison, and in announcing that he preferred it to England, he had indulged the most laudable form of boasting which lies in belittling our misadventures. He turned, and resuming his way, went off in long swinging strides towards the little huddle of huts built of mud and wattles, a miniature village enclosed in a stockade which the plantation slaves inhabited, and where he himself was lodged with them. Through his mind sang the line of Lovelace, "Stone walls do not a prison make, nor iron bars a cage." but he gave it a fresh meaning, the very converse of that which its author had intended. A prison, he reflected, was a prison, though it had neither walls nor bars, however spacious it might be. And as he realized it that morning, so he was to realize it increasingly as time sped on. Daily he came to think more of his clipped wings, of his exclusion from the world, and less of the fortuitous liberty he enjoyed. Nor did the contrasting of his comparatively easy lot with that of his unfortunate fellow convicts bring him the satisfaction a differently constituted mind might have derived from it. Rather did the contemplation of their misery increase the bitterness that was gathering in his soul. Of the 42 who had landed with him from the Jamaica Merchant, Colonel Bishop had purchased no less than 25. The remainder had gone to lesser planters, some of them to Speightstown, and others still farther north. What may have been the lot of the latter he could not tell, but amongst Bishop's slaves Peter Blood came and went freely, sleeping in their quarters, and their lot he knew to be a brutalizing misery. They toiled in the sugar plantations from sunrise to sunset, and if their labors flagged, there were the whips of the overseer and his men to quicken them. They went in rags, some almost naked. They dwelt in squalor, and they were ill-nourished on salted meat and maize dumplings. Food which to many of them was for a season at least so nauseating that 2 of them sickened and died before Bishop remembered that their lives had a certain value and labor to him, and yielded to Blood's intercessions for a better care of such as fell ill. To curb insubordination, one of them who had rebelled against Kent, the brutal overseer, was lashed to death by Negroes under his comrades' eyes, and another who had been so misguided as to run away into the woods was tracked, brought back, flogged, and then branded on the forehead with the letters F.T., that all might know him for a fugitive traitor as long as he lived. Fortunately for him, the poor fellow died as a consequence of the flogging. After that, a dull, spiritless resignation settled down upon the remainder. The most mutinous were quelled, and accepted their unspeakable lot with the tragic fortitude of despair. Peter Blood, alone escaping these excessive sufferings, remained outwardly unchanged, whilst inwardly the only change in him was a daily deeper hatred of his kind, a daily deeper longing to escape from this place where man defiled to foully the lovely work of his Creator. It was a longing too vague to amount to a hope. Hope here was inadmissible, and yet he did not yield to despair. He set a mask of laughter on his saturnine countenance, and went his way, treating the sick to the profit of Colonel Bishop, and encroaching further and further upon the preserves of the 2 other men of medicine in Bridgetown. Immune from the degrading punishments and privations of his fellow convicts, he was enabled to keep his self-respect, and was treated without harshness even by the soulless planter to whom he had been sold. He owed it all to gout and megrims. He had won the esteem of Governor Steed, and, what is even more important, of Governor Steed's wife, whom he shamelessly and cynically flattered and humored. Occasionally he saw Miss Bishop, and they seldom met but that she paused to hold him in conversation for some moments, evincing her interest in him. Himself, he was never disposed to linger. He was not, he told himself, to be deceived by her delicate exterior, her sapling grace, her easy boyish ways and pleasant boyish voice. In all his life, and it had been very varied, he had never met a man whom he accounted more beastly than her uncle, and he could not disassociate her from the man. She was his niece, and of his blood, and some of the vices of it, some of the remorseless cruelty of the wealthy planter must, he argued, inhabit that pleasant body of hers. He argued this very often to himself, as if answering and convincing some instinct that pleaded otherwise, and arguing it he avoided her when it was possible, and was frigidly civil when it was not. Justifiable as his reasoning was, plausible as it may seem, yet he would have done better to have trusted the instinct that was in conflict with it. Though the same blood ran in her veins as in those of Colonel Bishop, yet hers was free of the vices that tainted her uncle's, for these vices were not natural to that blood. They were, in his case, acquired. Her father, Tom Bishop, that same Colonel Bishop's brother, had been a kindly, chivalrous, gentle soul who, broken-hearted by the early death of a young wife, had abandoned the old world and sought an anodyne for his grief in the new. He had come out of the Antilles, bringing with him his little daughter, then 5 years of age, and had given himself up to the life of a planter. He had prospered from the first, as men sometimes will who care for nothing for prosperity. Prospering, he had bethought him of his younger brother, a soldier at home reputed somewhat wild. He had advised him to come out to Barbados, and the advice which at another season William Bishop might have scorned reached him at a moment when his wildness was beginning to bear such fruit that a change of climate was desirable. William came, and was admitted by his generous brother to a partnership in the prosperous plantation. Some 6 years later, when Annabella was 15, her father died, leaving her in her uncle's guardianship. It was perhaps his one mistake, but the goodness of his own nature colored his views of other men. Moreover, himself, he had conducted the education of his daughter, giving her an independence of character upon which perhaps he counted unduly. As things were, there was little love between uncle and niece, and she was dutiful to him, and he was circumspect in his behavior before her. All his life, and for all his wildness, he had gone in a certain awe of his brother, whose worth he had the wit to recognize, and now it was almost as if some of that awe was transferred to his brother's child, who was also, in a sense, his partner, although she took no active part in the business of the plantations. Peter Blood judged her, as we are all too prone to judge, upon insufficient knowledge. He was very soon to have cause to correct that judgment. One day, towards the end of May, when the heat was beginning to grow oppressive, there crawled into Carlisle Bay a wounded, battered English ship, the Pride of Devon, her freeboard scarred and broken, her coach a gaping wreck, her mizzen so shot away that only a jagged stump remained to tell the place where it had stood. She had been in action off Martinique with 2 Spanish treasure ships, and although her captain swore that the Spaniards had beset him without provocation, it is difficult to avoid a suspicion that the encounter had been brought about quite otherwise. One of the Spaniards had fled from the combat, and if the Pride of Devon had not given chase, it was probably because she was by then in no case to do so. The other had been sunk, but not before the English ship had transferred to her own hold a good deal of the treasure aboard the Spaniard. It was, in fact, one of those piratical affrays which were a perpetual source of trouble between the courts of St. James's and the Issurical, complaints emanating now from one and now from the other side. Steed, however, after the fashion of most colonial governors, was willing enough to dull his wits to the extent of accepting the English seaman's story, disregarding any evidence that might belie it. He shared the hatred so richly deserved by arrogant, overbearing Spain that was common to men of every other nation, from the Bahamas to the Main. Therefore he gave the Pride of Devon the shelter she sought in his harbor, and every facility to careen and carry out repairs. But before it came to this, they fetched from her hold over a score of English seamen, as battered and broken as the ship herself, and together these were some 6 Spaniards in like case, the only survivors of a boarding party from the Spanish galleon that had invaded the English ship and found itself unable to retreat. These wounded men were conveyed to a long shed on the wharf, and the medical skill of Bridgetown was summoned to their aid. Peter Blood was ordered to bear a hand in this work, and partly because he spoke Castilian, and he spoke it as fluently as his own native tongue. Partly because of his inferior condition as a slave, he was given the Spaniards for his patients. Now Blood had no cause to love Spaniards. His 2 years in a Spanish prison, and his subsequent campaigning in the Spanish Netherlands, had shown him a side of the Spanish character which he had found anything but admirable. Nevertheless, he performed his doctor's duties zealously and painstakingly, if emotionlessly, and even with a certain superficial friendliness towards each of his patients. These were so surprised at having their wounds healed instead of being summarily hanged that they manifested a docility very unusual in their kind. They were shunned, however, by all those charitably disposed inhabitants of Bridgetown who flocked to the improvised hospital with gifts of fruit and flowers and delicacies for the injured English seamen. Indeed, had the wishes of some of these inhabitants been regarded, the Spaniards would have been left to die like vermin, and of this Peter Blood had an example almost at the very outset. With the assistance of one of the negroes sent to the shed for the purpose, he was in the act of setting a broken leg when a deep, gruff voice that he had come to know and dislike, as he had never disliked the voice of a living man, abruptly challenged him. "What are you doing here?" Blood did not look up from his task. There was not the need. He knew the voice, as I have said. "I am setting a broken leg," he answered without pausing in his labors. "I can see that, fool." A bulky body interposed between Peter Blood and the window. The half-naked man on the straw rolled his black eyes to stare up fearfully out of a clay-colored face at this intruder. A knowledge of English was unnecessary to inform him that here came an enemy. The harsh, minatory note of that voice sufficiently expressed the fact. "I can see that fool, just as I can see what the rascal is. Who gave you leave to set Spanish legs?" "I am a doctor, Colonel Bishop. The man is wounded. It is not for me to discriminate. I keep to my trade." "Do you, by God? If you'd done that, you wouldn't be here now." "On the contrary, it is because I did it that I am here." I know that's your lying tale," the colonel sneered, and then, observing Blood to continue his work unmoved, he grew really angry. "Will you cease that and attend to me when I am speaking?" Peter Blood paused, but only for an instant. "The man is in pain," he said shortly, and resumed his work. "In pain, is he? I hope he is, the damned piratical dog. But will you heed me, you insubordinate knave?" The colonel delivered himself in a roar, infuriated by what he conceived to be defiance, and defiance expressing itself in the most unruffled disregard of himself. His long bamboo cane was raised to strike. Peter Blood's blue eyes caught the flash of it, and he spoke quickly to arrest the blow. "Not insubordinate, sir, whatever it may be. I am acting upon the express orders of Governor Steed." The colonel checked, his great face empurpling. His mouth fell open. "Governor Steed?" he echoed. Then he lowered his cane, swung round, and without another word to Blood rolled away towards the other end of the shed where the governor was standing at the moment. Peter Blood chuckled, but his triumph was dictated less by humanitarian considerations than by the reflection that he had balked his brutal owner. The Spaniard, realizing that in this altercation, whatever its nature, the doctor had stood his friend, ventured into a muted voice to ask him what had happened. But the doctor shook his head in silence, and pursued his work. His ears were straining to catch the words now passing between Steed and Bishop. The colonel was blustering and storming, the great bulk of him towering above the wizened little overdressed figure of the governor. But the little fop was not to be browbeaten. His Excellency was conscious that he had behind him the force of public opinion to support him. Some there might be, but there were not many, who held such ruthless views as Colonel Bishop. His Excellency asserted his authority. It was by his orders that Blood had devoted himself to the wounded Spaniards, and his orders were to be carried out. There was no more to be said. Colonel Bishop was of another opinion. In his views there was a great deal to be said. He said it, with great circumstance, loudly, vehemently, obscenely, for he could be fluently obscene when moved to anger. "You talk like a Spaniard, Colonel," said the governor, and thus dealt the colonel's pride a wound that was too smart resentfully for many a week. At the moment it struck him silent, and sent him stamping out of the shed in a rage for which he could find no words. It was 2 days later when the ladies of Bridgetown, the wives and daughters of her planters and merchants, paid her first visit of charity to the wharf, bringing their gifts to the wounded seamen. Again Peter Blood was there, ministering to the sufferers in his care, moving among those unfortunate Spaniards whom no one heeded. All the charity, all the gifts were for the members of the crew of the Pride of Devon. And this Peter Blood accounted natural enough. But rising suddenly from the redressing of a wound, a task in which he had been absorbed for some moments, he saw to his surprise that one lady detached from the general throng, and was placing some plantains and a bundle of succulent sugar cane on the cloak that served one of his patients for a coverlet. She was elegantly dressed in lavender silk, and was followed by a half-naked negro carrying a basket. Peter Blood, stripped of his coat, the sleeves of his coarse shirt rolled to the elbow, and holding a bloody rag in his hand, stood at gaze a moment. The lady, turning now to confront him, her lips parting in a smile of recognition, was Arabella Bishop. "The man's a Spaniard," said he, in the tone of one who corrects a misapprehension, and also tinged never so faintly by something of the derision that was in his soul. The smile with which she had been greeting him withered on her lips. She frowned and stared at him a moment, with increasing haughtiness. "So I perceive, but he's a human being none the less," said she. That answer, and its implied rebuke, took him by surprise. "Your uncle, the colonel, is of a different opinion," said he, when he had recovered. "He regards them as vermin, to be left to languish and die of their festering wounds." She caught the irony now more plainly in his voice. She continued to stare at him. "Why do you tell me this?" "To warn you that you may be incurring the colonel's displeasure. If he had his way, I should never have been allowed to dress their wounds." "And you thought, of course, that I must be of my uncle's mind?" There was a crispness about her voice, an ominous challenging sparkle in her hazel eyes. "I'd not willingly be rude to a lady even in my thoughts," said he, "but that you should bestow gifts on them, considering that if your uncle came to hear of it—" He paused, leaving the sentence unfinished. "Ah, well, there it is," he concluded, but the lady was not satisfied at all. "First you impute to me inhumanity, and then cowardice. Faith, for a man who would not willingly be rude to a lady even in his thoughts, it's none so bad." Her boyish laugh trilled out, but the note of it jarred his ears this time. He saw her now, it seemed to him, for the first time, and saw how he had misjudged her. "Sure now, how was I to guess that Colonel Bishop could have an angel for his niece?" said he recklessly, for he was reckless as men often are in sudden penitence. "You wouldn't, of course. I shouldn't think you often guess aright." Having withered him with that and her glance, she turned to her negro and the basket that he carried. From this she lifted now the fruits and delicacies with which it was laden, and piled them in such heaps upon the beds of the 6 Spaniards, that by the time she had so served the last of them, her basket was empty, and there was nothing left for her own fellow countrymen. These, indeed, stood in no need of her bounty, as she no doubt observed, since they were being plentifully supplied by others. Having thus emptied her basket, she called her negro, and without another word, or so much as another glance at Peter Blood, swept out of the place with her head high and chin thrust forward. Peter watched her departure. Then he fetched a sigh. It startled him to discover that the thought that he had incurred her anger gave him concern. It could not have been so yesterday. It became so only since he had been vouchsafed this revelation of her true nature. "Bad cess to it now, it serves me right. It seems I know nothing at all of human nature, but how the devil was I to guess that a family that can breed a devil like Colonel Bishop could also breed a saint like this?"